Okay, and we are live. So welcome everybody to the webinar, the monthly webinar on for legal services. This month we'll be covering SNAP or food stamps. We are very fortunate to have Larry Gardella. And for any of you who don't know who Larry Gardella is, and I think there might be two of you, Larry was the advocacy director before me for years and was here for 40 years and continues to do tons of work as a pro bono attorney for us, including leading probably our biggest federal case right now. So, and Carol Gundlach, Carol also was a former LSA employee, but how many years ago was that, Carol?
Oh my goodness, 25 maybe.
Yeah.
Long time.
I heard Carol's name 1,000 times before I ever met her. Carol is over at Arise and also works, does a lot of work over there, and I'm sure she'll tell us about it a little bit. But has a long history working in food stamps and all different sorts of benefits. And with that being said, and asking everybody, please don't put us on hold. If you have to go, you can hang up and call back. That's fine. Don't put us on hold, but do put us on mute unless you have a question. The easiest way to give us questions during this thing, and I will stop them if you have them, is to put it in the chat. Just type a question out there, and if Carol or Larry don't happen to see it, and I don't think they will because they're probably going to focus on teaching, I will raise your hand for you and ask whatever question. So if you have a question, go ahead and just chat it in there anytime, and I will make sure they answer it. Okay, so with no further ado, take it away.
Okay, this is Larry. I'm going to start, and before we talk about the details or any details on who's eligible for food stamps, there's one good thing that everybody at Legal Services should know is that the vast majority of your clients are eligible for food stamps. And you learn a lot about food stamps by asking clients who are not on food stamps why they're not on food stamps. And a lot of times that's how you're going to get some food stamp cases, because they're not going to be on food stamps for a reason that we're going to be talking about later. And you can help them get on food stamps, and you can monitor it and make sure it happens. So, great to get the details. You got the materials. The income guidelines change every year, just like legal services guidelines change. But the basic rule is somebody poor enough to be on legal services is poor enough to be getting food stamps and is likely not getting all the food stamps they should be getting, especially if they're elderly or disabled. Right, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, is what the Food and Nutrition Service has tried to get people to call the food stamp program for, it's double-digit years already, and it really doesn't work too well. Food stamps were called food stamps or food stamp coupons because you actually used to get these little stamps, a book of stamps that you used to buy the food. That has not been the case for an awful long time. Everybody who's got food stamps, what they've got is a debt, a card, like a regular bank card, and on that bank card is their food stamp allotment for the month. So there are no food stamps, which is why they're not supposed to be called food stamps. But if you ask your clients about SNAP, it's very unlikely they're going to know what you're talking about, no matter how many notices they've gotten from DHR using SNAP. And DHR is Department of Human Resources, which runs food stamps in Alabama. Carol, you want to have a little opening remark?
Yeah, I just want to really encourage everybody, in addition to asking if people are on food stamps, to screen for not just eligibility, but particularly, and we'll get to the ABOT issue, for underlying conditions that would make people exempt from work requirements. It's really like doing a disability screening. It's practically that detailed, but it's really important and makes a big difference for your clients. So Larry, go ahead and start with the slides and we can talk through this.
All right. The yeah, you use the benefits on your card to buy food. There are some foods you're not allowed to buy with food stamps, and the rules are a little bit complicated, but the general rule is anything you can buy at a store that takes food stamps, you're fine.
You can't buy paper products or any of the other stuff you can buy at the grocery store. It has to be consumable, and for most people cannot be already cooked. For most people.
You can't go to the deli part of the store and get something.
Get a sandwich.
Well, you can't get something prepared. You can get something from the deli part, but
yeah,
it's all right. That's not usually going to be the biggest source of problems. The stores don't get in too much trouble, and they'll sell just about anything. So the basic rule is you go to a grocery store or any place that sells food, and most of them take the food stamps. The food stamp, once somebody has low enough income that they're eligible for food stamps, the amount that they get depends on how much income they have and how many people are in their household. Household is a magic term for food stamp households, sort of like a legal services household. It's not everybody necessarily that lives there together. It's everybody that lives together and purchases food together.
And prepares together.
Purchases and prepares food together.
I think the next slide shows that. There we go. Yeah. No, it's
this just tells you how you can apply. The key thing there is that they can apply online. They can apply by printing a form and mailing it in. They can get it, they can hand deliver it. But the day that the application starts is the day that the food stamp folks get that application. So if you stick it in the mail, you're usually taking 3 days later before they start working on your case than if you do it online. Most of our clients, though, I think it's a minority of them that do apply online, but that is one of the options that's available.
Larry, let me add something here. The Feeding the Gulf Coast, which is a food bank in Mobile, has people placed all over the state, primarily in food banks, but also in community centers and places like that, who can help people apply online, and they can kind of walk them through the application process. That's particularly useful for clients who aren't real computer savvy. And you could call your local food bank, and they can tell you who the food stamp, I'm trying to remember what they call it, a guide is for their area.
Yeah, and these people, they can also help them gather their papers and, give them a little indication of what they need when they apply, make things a little bit easier for them. Something, especially some of these active food banks have really gotten very good at. So that's a good point, that almost anybody has the opportunity to apply online if they do it either on their own computer, library computer, or through a food stamp guide. Next slide. Yeah, the time deadline is generally 30 days for a food stamp office to act on a food stamp application, but there are people who have to be acted on within 7 days. That's somebody with very little gross income, under 150 a month. And here we do talk about resources. They can't have a lot of money in the bank or something, because otherwise they don't justify going through and stepping ahead of everybody else in line to get their food stamps. It's the way it's looked at. So not $100 in the bank, and the gross income and the monthly rent and utilities, basically, as long as we're in that ballpark, they're going to qualify to get expedited issuance. Migrant and seasonal farm workers can also get it. All right, now we're going to talk about who a household is. We started saying the concept is household. It can be individuals living alone. and it's the group of people living together who buy food together. But they're, you look at it, here's 5 people who live together in the same place. Well, they could be a 5-person food stamp household, but they also could be 5 separate households if they all buy and cook their food separately. Why would they ever want to do that? Well, the 5 people, if they did it separately, would be able to get a lot more food stamps than a family of 5. A household of 1 gets more than 1/5 as many food stamps as a household of 5. So there are advantages to breaking up households, but for people who want to eat together and buy food together, they should be applying as a household. And there are certain people who have to apply together. Married couple has to apply together. People living with children, 21 years, or even if you got a young child, they're going to be on your food stamp household. And then you even have these 3-generation households where if you're living with your parents and you got children living with you, you're generally not going to get a separate food stamp household. So you can't break everybody up, but you can, at least where, aside from the exceptions, you can break it up. And there even are people who can live together in the same household and have just one person do in the same house, one person does all the cooking and buying food. But if the reason the other one doesn't cook her food separately and buy the food separately is because of a severe disability that prevents them from doing that, they still can get to be separate households. That's something that the Department of Human Resources didn't want to do it that way, but they got sued, and they ended up with a policy across the whole country that anybody can do it that way. So that's just one thing you want to, when you've got somebody elderly, disabled, and somebody's taking care of them, that person can be a separate household. That can be advantage, as I said, for getting more food stamps for the 2 people. It also can be helpful, and this was something that the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Project was really happy about. You can have somebody that taking care of their aged parent who's disabled, and this person's, middle class, upper middle class, whatever, is not eligible for food stamps, but the parent doesn't have much income. They're eligible. The parent would be eligible as a separate food stamp household from the kids.
And Larry, let me just add on the last one for women in DV shelters. Even if the shelter has a cafeteria, or if everybody cooks for everybody else, which a lot of shelters do, they still can be separate households. So they don't, everybody in the shelter is never in the same household. Each woman and her children is a separate household. That's really a big advantage because they can save their SNAP benefits for when they leave shelter and have to stock a complete new kitchen. So, which most shelters let people do, is just save those stamps until they exit shelter.
Yeah, and when you're talking about DV shelters and the effect of benefits policy on DV shelter people, Carol is probably the expert in the state because of her interesting expertise working for the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, as well as various groups working for food stamp advocacy.
So is your advice, as long as you disclose everything, all the people living in the house, to try to separate the households out if you can, to get the maximum amount of food stamps?
You want to advise clients that it might be to their advantage, but you know, like some people are going to want to eat together. They're not going to want to cook separately. And that's fine, but I think it's up to the clients. It's our job to advise them of what their rights are and that if they can legitimately apply separately, they can get more food stamps. It's most important, like if you have a fiance situation, I don't know that you want to play that out too many times as two separate households. Once they have a child in common, they're not going to be able to be separate households. But if you have two unmarried people living together, they could be separate households. It's up to them, and we want to just make sure they understand what they have to do, and if they do it, they can get the added food stamp benefits. Yeah, and I think we have pretty much killed the 2 notes on household here. Okay, most households have to pass 2 thresholds. There's a gross income test and a net income test. The net income is after you've had a bunch of deductions, which we'll talk very little bit about the deductions, but there's also a gross income limit. And if you have more than the gross income and you're not disabled or elderly, it doesn't matter how much your rent is, how many other expenses you've got, you're not going to be eligible for food stamps. When you're looking at income, you count everything that you generally would assume you're going to count, wages, salaries, commissions, all your benefits. You don't count non-cash earnings unless it's, I mean, normally if you're getting some in-kind benefits, most in-kind benefits don't count. Contributions from family members count, but if they pay your bills for you, it generally does not count.
That's an important point, because if for example, your client can't pay their electric bill and their sister gives them $60 to pay their electric bill, that $60 should be reported and does count as income, so it would reduce their food stamps. However, if their sister actually pays their electric bill herself and your client never handles the money, then it doesn't count. It's what's called a vendor payment. And so it would not affect their food stamp benefits.
Yeah. The only way it could affect it is you to get the full shelter deduction and the utility deduction, you've got to pay some utility. But if you have 2 different utilities and your sister pays one of them all the time, but you have like electric and gas and you always pay your gas, you're going to get your full deductions even though she's paying your electric bill.
Correct.
And here are the income limits as of very, very recently. This is the current income guidelines. You'll notice that the net income is 100% of poverty, gross income 130% of poverty, which means you do have legal services clients that are over 130% of poverty. So some of them are going to have trouble with the gross income level. But an awful lot of those people, if they're elderly or disabled, they're going to not have to meet that 130, and getting them down to 100% of poverty may not be as hard as you might otherwise think. We can talk a little bit later about that. But the general rule is that they got to be less than 130% of poverty.
With a big exception, which I think we're going to get to in a minute.
Yeah, I think it's going to be on the next screen. But this points out if you're disabled or elderly, you only need to meet net. But there are some people who get some benefits, SSI or food family assistance, and it doesn't even matter what your it doesn't even matter how much your income is, you're automatically eligible. It's categorical eligibility for people, family assistance or SSI. Is that what you were going to mention?
Yeah, and family assistance is also TANF. So you're automatically eligible if you get SSI or TANF. And if you've got a household that contains an elderly person or a disabled person, the 130% of poverty gross income limit does not apply to them. They only have to meet the 100% net which is really helpful because there are deductions for things like medical bills that can get someone who's at, say, 140% of poverty down to 100% if they've got high medical costs or other costs.
Yeah, because the kinds of things that you can deduct. Yeah, we've talked about income limits. I guess we should mention self-employment. You get a standard deduction of 40% of gross proceeds, which could be better. There are some people who don't think it's fair to do it even that way, but most independent business people are not going to be on food stamps. But at least some people with some mom and pop type operations, certainly when they're starting out, are going to be eligible for food stamp, and it can be an important thing for somebody who is just starting out as self-employed to have those food stamp benefits at the beginning of the time.
And
I think we want to go to the next one. I think we're going to talk about deductions. If we don't, we'll talk about it a little bit anyway.
Are you going to, with the self-employment, although there's a 40% disregard, isn't there also some rule, or they have accepted a policy about people with their tax returns, like if you have really high net or really high gross, for like if you're a salesperson, that it doesn't, that they may use some other figure for your income?
Yeah, the food, Misty Ledbetter, who a lot of you know, who actually prepared these slides. Misty was involved in negotiating with the food stamp people and saying how unfair it was for someone who's like running a grocery type operation where your gross proceeds are so different than you're making such a little profit on it, that they were able to allow certain deductions even before you start dealing with the 40%. So it's we're just going to say there are some things you can do, but we're not going to go into the details. You can certainly get the 40%, and there may be other things to do. Yeah, the asset limits, we don't really worry too much about the asset limits. They really only affect people who are, where there's somebody who's been disqualified from food stamps for some reason and they can't be excluded from the household. Then it's going to affect the whole household because their income's going to count. They can't have more than, the resource is going to. So it's strong reason if you've got somebody who's living in living with people, and one of the people who's living there is disqualified from food stamps for some reason. We may talk a little bit about the reasons you might get disqualified, but if somebody is disqualified from food stamps, you want to try and get them outside of the household if at all possible. If they're not married and they don't fit in the children thing, you should be able to do it. If it's because if you can exclude that person, then everybody else is free from the asset limit and free from having the income of the disqualified person affecting how much food stamps they get. And again, if you're on SSI or family assistance, it doesn't matter. But before we talk about work, I did want to talk some about deductions because I don't think we have a slide on deductions. So what you normally are deducting is shelter expenses. You get a work deduction, not much of a work deduction. You get a little deduction for earned income. You get a deduction for your housing, your shelter allowance. You get a deduction for your utility costs. Everybody gets those, but there are caps on how much you can deduct depending on, like you can only deduct so much of your rent. If you had income of $600 and you paid rent of $590, you say, hey, I'm down to $10 net income. Well, no, because they have a limit on how much you can deduct as a rent expense. But if you're elderly or disabled, you don't have that limit on how much you can deduct as a shelter expense. You also have the right, as Carol mentioned, to deduct medical expenses. which include the expense of driving to the doctors, driving to pick up your prescriptions, all your prescription drugs, and indeed all your non-prescription drugs too, as long as a doctor will certify that you need something, vitamins, what have you, you can deduct that as a medical expense. You can deduct the dog food you buy for a dog that you have as a service animal or have a medical need for having a pet. So there's loads and loads of deductions, which is why you've got somebody well over 130% who's elderly and disabled. You've got a really good chance of getting them way under 100%. So you not only get them on food stamps, but you can get them a healthy amount of food stamps. A lot of our clients have said they don't want to bother with the food stamp program for just a small benefit, but they really want the opportunity if they could be getting a lot more. And a lot of times they can. The medical deductions, I've seen cases where it makes a difference between somebody getting like $10 or $20 and getting $120. And so it's something that most food stamp offices don't work real hard to get them all the medical deductions. There is a flat medical deduction that they can get, and they will normally get, but you can push for more, and it is often in our clients' interest. When we talk about income and deductions, everyone starts probably rolling their eyes. How am I going to figure out whether somebody is eligible or how much they're supposed to be getting to know whether it's worth their while to bother or whether they're getting the proper amount? And the easiest thing is to just know that there's income limits, know that there's these deductions, but instead of doing the calculations on pen and paper, you just go online and search for a good food stamp calculator. And if you get a food stamp calculator, I think there's one, Carol said there's one on the DHR website, there's one on from Food and Nutrition, FNS, but there's gobs of them. You put in income information, you put in age, you put in what kind of income, you just answer a couple of questions, and after you answer those questions, you get an estimate of about how much in food stamps that client should be getting.
And this is another place where the advocates at the food banks can be really helpful, because they can work with people to dig into their deductions and help them get verification so they can get their deductions.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you tell a client, what all they're entitled to, and then they go, you can convince them they should go into the food stamp office. It's just so valuable to follow up with them or have, give them a call or 30 days after they've gone to the food stamp office and say, hey, what happened when you went to the food stamp office? Did you get approved? How much did you get? And if they didn't get it, what you think they're entitled to, you would be able to see whether they were able to document the medical expenses, and if not, you could help them to document the medical expenses, or you could even ask them to go over to the food bank, and the food bank will help them document the expenses. What we normally can do is to call a food stamp supervisor if we know there's some way the client can prove that they're entitled to a bunch of deductions or meet the verification requirements that's outside of the usual way. And the food stamp supervisors have been told basically they have to work with legal services to see if they can get the person on food stamps. So that's something you have available to you, and you also have these resources at the food banks to help get these people eligible for food stamps. That's it for deductions, I guess, for the moment, because you're just going to use those calculators. Now we can go to work.
And Larry, just to add, I just remembered the name that the food banks call their advocates. They're called navigators. They're called SNAP navigators. So you call your food bank, ask to get in touch with the navigator that works for that local food bank.
I guess they stole the name from the Affordable Care.
Yeah.
Else the stealing went in the other direction.
Yeah, one or the
other. Work, generally the idea is that food stamps, in order to get food stamps, you've got to, and if you're able to work, you're supposed to work. There are exemptions. We're not going to go through the exemptions, but basically you have a young child, a very, very young child, you've got a disability, you're going through training, you're working already enough, you're going to be exempt, or if you're in college.
And over 55.
Yeah, or in high school, or you're under 18. I mean, you're going to be exempt from the work requirement. If you're between 18 and 50, or 18 and 49 and 364 days, you've got an additional work requirement. This is the ABOD requirement. Adults.
Able-bodied adults without children.
Yeah, that's it. Adults with able bodies and no kids, no dependents. But those people, in addition to any other work requirement, have to, or if they're not involved in a working training program, at least 80 hours a month. Generally, that's said to be 20 hours a week, but as you all know, there's 20 times 4 1/3 ends up being more than 80, and all you need to do is have 80 hours in a month, and you meet the exemption for ABOD. It can be working, it can be attending a training program, and some of these training programs, Carol and I were talking about before, they are really good training programs. There's skill training. I had a client who went to a training program so he could get his commercial driver's license and get to be a commercial trucker. And then somebody else who went to welding school, and welders can make really good money. So, I mean, there are ways of linking into really good training programs. There are, you can go for your GED, and that counts as training if you go through the right hoops. If you just go to a GED without showing up with anyone with the food stamp program or with the right employment service, it's not going to count as meeting the requirement, but you should be able to move it into that category, because as long as you play the game right and you say, I want now to be given this training credit. For earnings or for working, it doesn't even matter whether you're getting cash. If you are working those 80 hours a month and all you're getting out of it is free rent, because you're working, you're working for your relatives, and they're letting you stay in one of their houses, that may be enough to make you exempt from ABOD. If you're volunteering, like at your church, you're gonna, most people don't volunteer 80 hours a month, but somebody who works a little bit, gets a little bit of training, and volunteers a little bit at their church, you add all those things they're doing up, and that adds to 80 hours, they're meeting the work requirement.
And this is where to say that when we're talking about ABODs, I think there are two really important issues that you probably are going to need some help sorting through with your clients. One is, what is the definition of work, and how you can build those 80 hours and verify those 80 hours. And either I or Larry or Michael or probably many other people, working with food banks can help you try to figure out how to build those 80 hours. The other one is who's exempt from this ABOD requirement. There is a list of exemptions that's 100 miles long. I am not sure that we couldn't be able to exempt out just about everybody that they say is an ABOD. It's anybody with any kind of disability, including a very minor one, anyone who's in substance abuse treatment, anyone who's homeless, on and on and on. So screening really well for building those 80 hours of work or for exempting your client from the requirement in the first place is going to take you all digging a lot into that client's circumstances, because the client's not going to know that they're exempt, for example, because they have a cognitive disorder. They're just not a cognitive disability. They're not going to know that makes them exempt from ABOD. So you're going to have to figure that out for them.
Yeah, and the exemption, there are forms that they can get filled in by doctors. It can be by a psychologist. It can be by a nurse at the doctor's office. It can be, it doesn't.
Social work, a counselor, someone leading a substance abuse group, including AA, can all sign that this person's meets an exemption requirement.
Yeah, they use the term unfit for work, but it's not meant to be equivalent with disability. It means there's something that's making them difficult for them to work. And, someone with a 10% service-connected disability is eligible because that's actually went out as federal policy. And then the state has the right to decide what other kinds of people are unfit to work, even in terms of categories. That's why they chose to say all chronically homeless people are. And the homeless exception, it counts all your DV victims who live in shelters and other DV victims who would be at risk of getting murdered if they went to work and their abuser knew where to get to them. Those people should qualify under existing policy in Alabama to be exempt from ABOD. And I do believe that DHR is going to clarify that and just say some, if not all, at least some category of DV victims are exempt from ABOD.
Anybody who's in shelter should be exempt. Anybody who's chronically homeless, is living on the street or in a car or someplace like that, is going to be exempt. People who are doubled up, however, are not exempt. So if you're living on your sister's couch, then you would not be exempt by being homeless. But you may have some other exemption, which is, again, it's a reason you need to screen carefully.
Right, because if you're living in your sister's couch, most of the time you're doing something to live there for free. So, yeah. And that should end up as a work requirement. Yeah, I mean, if somebody is denied, or if they're denied exempt status, or they're not given as much food stamps as they think they're entitled to, they can, they have a right to request an informal conference. They have a 10-day limit for that, and then 60 days to request a fair hearing. In order to keep your food stamps going at the same level they are, you have to ask for a fair hearing before, and whatever it is, if they say they're going to terminate you in 20 days, you have to ask for your hearing in 20 days. But other than that, you've got 60-day time limit for a hearing. The Department of Human Resources, Kim Dobbs, in their legal office, has asked that before requesting a fair hearing, we try the informal conference, talking with the county supervisor and see if we can work it out. And if we can't, and the client's still not pushing that fair hearing deadline, it may be worth a phone call to Kim, who will do what she can to get these people on food stamps. And so, I'm not saying don't request the hearing. You want to make sure you protect the client's right, but I think you actually may have a better chance of getting this even before you go to a hearing. So.
And just as with Social Security, As long as you've got a release from the client, you can go to DHR and sit down and look at their file and see the documentation that led to the adverse action.
Yeah, and we have had, historically, we had food stamp offices that would not do anything, talk to us until we had a release that they thought was a sufficient release. The current situation seems to be we call a supervisor and they don't even remember to ask us for a release. They just talk. So,
and my experience has been you could have a hypothetical conversation with the supervisor as long as there's some trust there between you and the supervisor. So you could say, hypothetically, if somebody did blank, and they would say, well, hypothetically, this could have happened. And, so even if you don't have a release and the food stamp office is 2 counties away, sometimes you can still have that phone conversation.
And sometimes you can actually get the supervisor to talk about the particular client's case without even showing that there's you may not be able to, and you certainly want to get the client to sign a retainer form, and the retainer should be sufficient for a release. So that's moving about adverse actions.
Let me add one more thing on adverse actions. We might get to this later, but I'm not sure we will. Until about 3 years ago, anybody with a felony conviction that involved drugs was automatically not eligible to get food stamps. That's actually a state law. We changed it about 3 years ago, but a lot of clients are not going to know this because they applied for food stamps, say, before the law changed and got denied, and they don't realize that the law has changed. And so if you get anyone who says, well, I couldn't get food stamps because I have a criminal conviction, you need to get them to reapply because they probably are eligible now.
Yeah. I mean, all they have to have done is done their time and made one try at rehab. And most people who are on drugs have at least tried once on rehab.
And they just have to be in compliance with the conditions of their parole. And truth be told, DHR is not going to check on that. They are not calling parole officers to confirm that. So, as long as they've done their time, they should be able to get SNAP.
There was another category of people who were disqualified from food stamps, and a bunch of people were disqualified a few years ago because they were using their food stamps at stores that they were found to have been cheating the food stamp program. The store was basically buying some food stamps and making money out of, or giving people paper products and paying utility bills with food stamps, and all that was going on. And they figured people who were spending a bunch of their food stamps at those stores were going to be disqualified. And as a result of advocacy pretty much across the state in Alabama, we were able to get the department to basically back off disqualifying individuals except for the most egregious cases and concentrate on disqualifying the stores. I think that some people who were disqualified on that basis, if anyone has been disqualified on that basis, we'd have a chance of getting them back onto food stamps. It would be something you'd want to talk with Mary Jane or me, and I think there's something we could do for anybody in that category. If you talk to someone and find out that's why they're not on food stamps. If they really were committing out and out blatant fraud, I don't think we're going to get anywhere, but there's an awful lot of gray area in there.
So you don't have to request the informal conference to ask for the fair hearing? There's no connection between those two things?
No.
No, you can do both. You can even do both at the same time. They would prefer you do the informal request before you set up the hearing, because once you set up the hearing, it sets up some process and costs them some money. But you're free to ask for both ask for just one, or ask for one and then ask for the other. So it works either way. Yeah, someone denied, somebody terminated, somebody's reduced, somebody's not getting enough. All of those are the ones we've sort of been talking about. Overpayment of benefits. Most of the food stamp cases that we've had in recent years have been overpayment cases where somebody got food stamps that they were not entitled to or thought not to be entitled to. And there's 3 levels of overpayments. One is from a error made by the food stamp office alone. The client gives all the information, the food stamp office blows it and gives them too many food stamps. There's others where the client is committing out and out fraud, and then there's sort of inadvertent household error. The fraud ends up with a nasty penalties and everything. The one thing that clients have a hard time understanding, and some advocates have a hard time understanding, is it doesn't matter, even if it was the food stamp office's fault, if you got an overpayment, the department has to try and recover that overpayment. Then the Notice of Suspected Intentional Program Violation, IPV, that's sort of French for fraud. So when a client has been found, is charged with fraud and has a hearing that's a fraud hearing, we want to see if we can get involved. If the case has gone, instead of a disqualification, administrative disqualification, instead it's been sent directly to prosecution, we cannot get involved. If we were involved at the IPV level, they're not supposed to go IPV and then go to fraud court and to court, it's referred to a district attorney. If they ever do, if we worked on the IPV, we'd be able to also work on the criminal case. And that would be something you'd have to deal with Michael about.
And Larry, let me add, I've seen some figures, both national and state by state, on IPV, and the rates are really high. There's a lot of things that should be inadvertent client error that get designated as IPVs. And so the chance of winning those is probably pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times the clients don't understand the requirements as well as they might. And one other, like when I gave some training on food stamp fraud, criminal prosecutions to a former governor who was doing these as appointed counsel. And I basically told him, look, if they're trying to get somebody on just 1 month, 1 certification period, most of the time the food stamp office is not going to have the proof that they actually lied about something. They'll say, the food stamp office may say they failed to report something, but the food stamp office would have to admit that they lose an awful lot of documents that do get reported. So most of the intentional program violation is going to be for a client who had some income and then actually went to the food stamp office and denied having that income. So they have a hard time proving that the client did not send something in.
I've seen some around household composition where they treat those as IPVs, and a lot of the time that really is client error. They not always, but a lot of the time it really is client error, especially if it involves a child who's bouncing back and forth between 2 parents and they're both claiming them in their household. That gets designated IPV, and very often it's just the clients are confused.
And I mean, it is something that happens all the time.
Yes,
you've got
it is.
The kids with shared custody. You have adult children who leave the home and then come back to the home. It gets really complicated, and I think you have an awful good chance of beating those IPVs. So, just saying. Next slide.
I think the next slide is going to be the credit slide.
All right. Well, we're running low on time, so
We have about 8 minutes, and so this would be the great time for folks to ask any questions if they have any. And I do have a couple that have come up. So if a case comes into legal services and someone says they don't think that, I think you've covered all the parts of this, but haven't put together maybe the whole thing. Someone comes in and says, I don't think I get the benefits I'm supposed to get. How would an advocate even start figuring out what they're supposed to get?
First step is to go to a food stamp calculator and run it there and get a ballpark idea. You're not going to get a precise number, but you should get a pretty good guess how much they should be getting. Make sure when you're asking the client, you are asking about all the possible deductions, especially if you've got elderly or disabled, and there are those extra deductions like the medical deductions. So once you get all that information, if the client, what normally we do is tell the client to go in with more documentation of the expenses and then follow up with that client. And that's where it's really important that you make sure the client's aware that they go in, they present this information, or sometimes we can even present it for them. But if we follow up with that client, and we're going to be able to find out whether they are getting whether they're getting the full deductions. And if they're not, we should be able to work it out with the supervisor or even request a hearing.
And the other thing I wanted to ask to make sure we got at least give you time. I've gone to the next slide, acknowledging that this whole PowerPoint was ripped off from Misty, who apparently joined us. So she's listening to you guys. So you can thank her.
I miss you.
You can thank her for the PowerPoint. But Carol, before we end, you didn't really tell everyone about what Arise does when we introduced you, and I want to make sure at least the 2 or 3 minute version. I'm sure at least half the people listening know exactly what Arise is, but a lot of them are new and probably don't have any idea. So can you tell us what Arise does in 2 or 3 minutes?
I'd be delighted. Alabama Arise is a nonprofit advocacy organization. We work on state and some federal issues that affect low-income people, things like our tax structure, our state budgets, Medicaid expansion, and the Affordable Care Act, predatory lending, so on and so on. We're a membership organization, so if you are not a member of Alabama Arise, you should be. That means you would get to help set our priorities for each year. Come to our lobby day, get lots of information from us, regular newsletters and legislative alerts with some action you can do to help your clients beyond their legal needs. We are very involved in advocating for improvements to the food stamp program and against some really horrible things that the House of Representatives is trying to do as they reauthorize the Farm Bill. And we are very active in trying to protect SNAP and all other safety net programs from attacks by the Alabama legislature. We're easy to get to. We're in Montgomery. So if you've got questions, give us a call. We also have lots of fact sheets and information on SNAP, and particularly on the ABOT issue. We have some fairly detailed fact sheets that we'd be glad to share with you.
And one other thing I think you need to know about Arise is that they are the leading force right now against adding a work requirement to Medicaid in Alabama.
Yes.
And, so work requirement we talked about in food stamps, that's allowed federally. Federal law never allowed a work requirement in Medicaid, and I don't really think it does now, but President Trump disagrees with me, so that he's, that they are looking into it. Alabama has put in to do this, and it was up for public comment, and the leading voice against it with some very good, very persuasive, very well articulated position is Arise.
Thank you.
And I will note that Misty says that Carol and Larry, she loves and misses both of you, and that you guys did a great job. So
Thank you. Miss you too.
unless either of you have anything else to add, I think we have hit our time limit. Maybe one more minute. Do either of you have anything to add?
I don't.
Just for the people in legal services who keep saying they never see a food stamp case, the best thing you can do is to find the clients who aren't on food stamps, explain to them how they appear to be eligible, and tell them that you're willing to back them up if they'll apply and they have any trouble.
Which is exactly why Mary Jane still does a majority of our food stamp cases, because like she finds food stamp cases. They come into her as evictions or garnishments, and they leave as food stamp cases. Which these days, when we have so many other problems with the garnishment statutes and all the other stuff, it's great if you can give a client a couple $100 to help feed their family. So awesome. Before I let everyone go, the one thing I did want to make sure is that if you attended by phone but were here for more than 50 minutes, that you send me an email. We will be applying for credit for this to get CLE credit. That's not a guarantee they're going to give it to us, but they usually do. But otherwise, and I will be sending out a copy of the materials. Someone's already asked for them, and they will be sent out immediately afterwards. I think I will probably just send them to the empowerment group, and Ray if she's not in that, because she asked for them. And but otherwise, if you'd like them, I can send them to you, or they will be available once Tommy has gotten the new portal / whatever, I forget the name right now, but once we've got that magical technology that we've been promised for several years and it's actually up and running. So with that being said, thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, Larry. You're my heroes. Hope to talk to you both soon. But otherwise, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.